What's up, everybody? I hope you're doing well. Welcome to the extended cut, minimally edited podcast version of this week's episode, where we are going to try to talk about the election. I'm just going to say this part first to get it out of the way. Anytime anyone says anything at all about the election, even when they do everything in their reasonable power to be as inclusive and respectful as possible, there will always be someone who hears something as inflammatory. So if something feels inflammatory, just know it's not my intent to try to make you feel that way, but I know it's still going to happen. Do you know what I mean? I'm sorry, I'm not trying to step on anyone's toes. With that said, what I would like to talk about is how supporting our clients during the election has affected us as therapists. Obviously, that's going to affect everyone differently, but I think it's impacted all of us in our own ways and also impacts therapists in a unique way. Now, I'm sure in this extended cut version of this episode, there's going to be all kinds of like rambly Marie thoughts and tidbits interspersed in here beyond what you would find in the typical official episode that posts on YouTube. So just naming that, like if you're not feeling any of my like little anecdotal things that I sprinkle in between, you might find the shorter version a little bit more easy to digest, I guess. Now, this episode is about how the election is affecting therapists, but as I said, someone's going to hear something as inflammatory, and before, there's sort of unproductive he said, she said things happening in the comments of this episode, I just want to say, I both deeply value people holding and expressing their opinions and views. That is an important part of, I think an important human right that we all have. But I also deeply value at the same time being able to be respectful of each other and find a way to move forward together, even when we have very different perspectives on a situation, and even if we really disagree with each other. So I'm just asking, do your best to be respectful. It doesn't mean that you can't speak your mind, but do so in a way that doesn't degrade the humanity of whoever else might be listening. We are in a cultural moment, at least in the US, where it's considered pretty acceptable to kind of degrade somebody else just based on knowing how they voted. Like, we see how somebody voted, and if it's different than how we voted, we kind of degrade their humanity, or we do things like call someone evil, or even if it's not as such harsh language, we kind of otherize and dehumanize each other. And that's our mind's way of kind of figuring out how to cope with such a seemingly giant discrepancy that we're never going to get along. And obviously friendships are broken over how people vote. Families are falling apart. It deeply affects us, because the only way we have been able to cope a lot of times with our differences in voting is to sort of view the other person as somewhat less than human as a result, because how else could they have voted so differently? That's how our brains think, at least, right? So for me, something that really helps me stay grounded and respectful is to remind myself that generally speaking, however someone voted, whether it's for a person or a policy, they decided who they voted for based on what they thought was best given their values, and above and beyond just that most of the time, those values align with my values, even when they voted differently than me. So, for example, I'm going to vote for things that I think advocate for safety, for human rights, for what's best for my family and myself, without harming other people. And I think most people use some of those values when they vote. There's going to always be people who are just what's in it for me, screw everyone else. But that's going to be fringe, and that's going to be true regardless of your political party. But most people are genuinely trying to make an honestly good, ethical decision when they decide who or what policy they vote for. And I have to cling to that, even if we have very different interpretations of what sorts of policies and things like that are going to best align with those values. And even if we're not looking to disrespect another human, maybe we might come at it by saying then maybe if I explain why I voted the way I voted, or why I think this is maybe the correct way to vote or the best way to vote, that maybe that will help somebody increase their empathy, or maybe see that the way I voted makes more sense or something. But we just know based on research over and over again that whenever we present more of our opinion, it just makes someone who already disagrees continue to disagree or even go even further into whatever other position they have. This is just me sharing some 2 cents, not as a political expert, but as someone who's very interested in finding a way for people with very different perspectives, opinions, beliefs to still come together and find a way to be respectful and move forward together. And I think right now, the way that we're approaching it as a society, culturally in the media, in social media, and also at the individual level, like in our relationships, is just only perpetuating the same problem. So I'm much more interested in seeing if we can find ways to empathize with what the other's going through, finding the threads that align, and doing the best we can to uphold the ways that we are similar. Rant over. So today's episode, I really wanted to just check in with you all and say, like, how are you doing after the election? How is it going supporting your clients who are processing the election while you are simultaneously processing the election? I know how it's affected me and some of my close therapist friends, and it's clearly affected all of us. So I thought I would ask you all to see what's going on with that. And in order to find some answers, I turned to Instagram. I only log into Instagram these days to post a poll like this one, or to check in on my few friends that I do connect with only on Instagram and don't like chat via text message or something like that. I dusted it off and cracked it open and put this poll out there. So I appreciate all of you who responded to this poll. I posted 3 questions in the poll. The first question was, what's been the hardest part of supporting your therapy clients post-election? The second question was, what's been the most positive part about supporting your therapy clients post-election? And the third question, how has it affected you to support your therapy clients while doing your own processing? My intent in how I phrased these questions was to create space for, whether you're grieving right now or celebrating right now after the election, that you could equally feel like you could be seen and heard in the way that I framed these questions. Thank you so much to everyone who responded to this poll. As always, I will keep all responses anonymous, but it's not lost on me as I read through your responses. Well, first of all, they're not, I see your name, your username pop up. So they're, visible to me in that sense, but it's still a vulnerable thing to just type it out, send it over. So I really appreciate all of your responses. Initially, I was going to try to run through all the responses to see if I could find themes, but then I kind of stopped myself because I realized if I tried to theme things together, it would still largely probably be from my own kind of biased lens. So I'm just going to read some of them and share some of my thoughts in between as I read them. Okay, so let's dive into some of your responses for the first question. What's been the hardest part of supporting your therapy clients post-election? And for this question, there are 23 responses. Again, I appreciate all of you who responded. It stands out to me that far fewer people responded to my questions for this poll than typical. Like, it'd be pretty common for me to get like 60 replies or something like that, which to me, I already interpret that as like a takeaway. Like, I put out these questions and maybe someone who might typically choose to respond is like, I don't want to answer that question. And if I put myself in the shoes of somebody seeing this poll pop up, like, I might skip over and be like, I don't even want to talk about this right now. So I wonder if that's already kind of saying something that it's exhausting. Like, why do we want to talk about the election one more time? So there's that. Maybe there's a different reason why people didn't respond, but I'm just wondering out loud if that could be at play. So responding to this question, what's been the hardest part of supporting your therapy clients post-election? One person says, going through it myself at the same time. Ooh, yes. I think that one's probably true for a lot of us, that it was just sort of like, okay, I guess we're doing this. I guess we're doing this now. Whew. Some of these I see are just so weighty that I'm going to read them out loud, and I'm almost speechless. So I'll just read them and I won't necessarily share my reactions. Someone says, supporting rape survivors who felt they couldn't speak up and now they feel people never will. Someone else says, after my workday is done and I have to try to do self-care, I recommend all day. Someone else says, allowing them to say their piece. So that's kind of interesting. I think you can kind of catch too, for some of us, the hardest part was having to support people going through something hard when we were going through something hard. But it's also an interesting thing to imagine somebody else is going through something hard when maybe you're celebrating. Like, I can put myself in those shoes. If, the other candidate won, then I would be celebrating. But I'd have some clients who would be going through a really hard time. And that would be hard. I might use the phrasing, allowing them to say their piece about that rather than, feeling more of that empathy around it. Someone else says, general assumption that all therapists are liberal. That's an interesting thought. Like if we really just set aside the election and just wonder like amongst therapists in the US, like what our representation is about maybe how we would tend to vote compared to the general US population. Like I kind of had assumed that maybe therapists generally represent how the US votes overall. I could be wrong. I don't know. Did 51% of therapists vote for the current president-elect? That's an interesting question. I don't know. There's probably a study on this. I did not look it up. So if you know the answer, feel free to leave a comment. But that is a curious thing. And to feel like, yeah, people don't understand. I remember this was the 2008 election. I was in my first year of grad school. And I remember going to school on election day. I'd already voted. And then one of my professors said, she started a sentence like, hopefully everyone has voted for Obama, obviously. And I remembered like, I had a visceral reaction to her saying that. Like, wait, you just assume that everyone voted that way? And I just like looked around the room of like 15 of us in the class and just being like, did everyone vote for Obama? I'm sure not everyone voted for Obama, but like, this professor seems very confident that obviously all of us voted for Obama. Anyway, that was very interesting. So that is an assumption that I think exists. Whether it's true or not, I don't know the answer. The next person says, client repeats lies that have been proven false about Trump, but knowing I can't discuss it with them. Yeah, I could totally see, like when we have clients who have a really different worldview than us, just hearing them process out loud and supporting them through it, it's difficult. It's a very difficult. So I hear that. Someone else says, one of my clients is worried about having children now, especially a girl. Someone else says, showing up for clients who voted against their own rights as well as mine. Yes, I mean, obviously the ones that I relate with, I relate. But if you didn't vote that way, then maybe you don't see it that way. But that's really painful. I have so many things I would like to say, and I realize everything that I could say is going to just be seen as polarized or inflammatory because I obviously have my opinions, very much so. So I'll just say that I do personally empathize with that reflection, but I know that there are going to be people listening who say that's not what happened, but we have different perspectives, and that's okay. Someone else says the hardest part is sitting with folks who are in a precarious immigration status and fearing for their ability to stay. Whew, yeah. I mean, it's scary. And then this one's interesting because it feels like connected to me. Someone says the hardest part is it's been hard to see other therapists making posts that seem to encourage fear. That's interesting. I don't use social media except to the extent that YouTube is technically social media, but it's also a search engine. So I haven't really been exposed to what other therapists are saying out there on social media, but I could imagine that being the case. And that's maybe a question of like, if it's not helpful to encourage fear, but maybe fear is a reasonable reaction in this situation, what's a more helpful post to make that's based in reality? And you may not believe that there's reason to be afraid, but see how nuanced these things are? Okay. Someone else says, sometimes it feels like we, our field, fan flames instead of simply validate and hold space. Yeah. I mean, that's a question that's been coming up for me. Like, what is the role of therapists? Like whether it's we're meeting with our individual clients or we're posting on social media, or our role like as a profession, as like hopefully in an idealistic world, we can sort of model for everyone else, like, here's how to talk about politics in a healthy, safe way, in a way that validates our humanity, that validates our desire for forward movement, and also involves hard conversations, compromises, things like that. Like, can we model all of those things rather than just sort of lean into some of the unhealth that there's already plenty of that around? I don't know. I don't claim to have the answer, but I do feel quite strongly that the way we're doing it as a society isn't working. And I think there's a real opportunity for therapists to do it differently that at least like moves the needle in a better direction, even if it's not perfect. Someone else says, many of them are less upset than I am, and I am bothered by that. I mean, definitely there's a thread around like when your client has a really different perspective than you or voted differently than you. That's really hard to sit with. Someone else says, holding space for their big feelings while also deeply in processing my own. Yeah, so that's kind of almost the opposite. Like I feel really similar to my client, but it's such big feelings, so it's like almost fanning the flames of my big feelings. Someone else says, instilling hope in clients when I'm having a hard time feeling hopeful about the future. Yeah, those last two feel sort of similar. Like if as therapists, we're supposed to embody some sort of hope, hopefully some hope for our clients and some sort of like stable strength. If anything throws us off our game, then it's much more difficult for us to be that for our clients. Here, someone else says, sharing in some of their fears. It makes the fear exponential for me. Now we're hearing something similar pop up again. I want to provide hope for them, and it's hard to do when I have similar fears. Someone else says, simply the fact that all of my clients are deeply affected, so every session has been intense. Yeah. Definitely. And here someone else says, danger feeling very ominous, yet so expected for a lot of them, especially a part of the trans community. Ooh, yes, I feel that. The assumption that I'm either upset with the results or overjoyed. That's really interesting. That one stands out to me, especially because I don't think I had clients make assumptions about me. I'm sure they make assumptions about me. They didn't state out loud assumptions about me and, my perceptions of the election. So that's kind of interesting too, like what's the context where, I could see that coming out. I didn't experience that. So I'm not going to read every single response, but the ones that remain kind of reiterate things we might have heard someone else say already. And for those of you listening to the extended cut version of this episode, I'll share a little bit about what the hardest part of supporting my therapy clients was for me and just kind of what it looked like for me election week and seeing therapy clients. And yeah, I only see therapy clients one day a week, which happens to be Wednesdays. So I went to bed on Tuesday already, I guess you could say, accepting what ended up being the final official results of the presidential election. And like full disclosure, I am deeply grieved by those results, but also not surprised. And I think that is a specific thing to me, because it sounds like, at least in my immediate circles, my friends who voted the same way as I did in the presidential election were like shocked by the results. And to me, I was shocked in 2016. But then I was like, we did this before. So, if we're capable of doing something once, we're very capable of doing it again. Because that really shocked me in 2016. So maybe that's like a coping mechanism. And instead of like freaking out or feeling shocked, I just was like, yeah, I think it's going to happen again. Unfortunately, I hope I'm wrong, but here we go. And then it sort of went the way that I suspected. So I wasn't shocked, but still deeply grieved. And when the official election results came out, I think at Pacific time, like 6:30 a.m. Pacific time or something like that on Wednesday, and I woke up at 6:30 a.m. and saw my first client at 9 a.m. And yeah, I mean, I think what happened for it was like, okay, these are the results. Whatever my feelings are about this, like real, true feelings, they're going to just like wait. We're just going to wait till after Wednesday to truly feel whatever they are. And that's like it's both a skill and kind of a shadow side for me. I think this comes from growing up in a household with a narcissistic parent where like I can just shove all my emotions into a corner and be like, it's like they're not there. And fortunately, I still have like full access to them and I can pull them out at this point in my life. Generally, it seems kind of in a voluntary way. But I was just like, oh, I'm sure I have feelings and I'm going to work today, so we'll address those later. And I went into it with it being a full day, seeing therapy clients. And yeah, my first client, I mean, I obviously won't share details about my clients, but I'll share like overall, like most of my clients spent at least half the session processing election stuff and generally embody people groups that are very afraid of their rights, whatever various rights they might be concerned about. I mean, let me remind you that my brand and my specialty is that I'm an affirming Christian therapist. So a lot of my clients identify as queer. Like I had clients like kind of entertaining the idea of like going back into the closet because maybe that might be safer. Like this sort of very, very, I'm afraid for my own safety kind of responses. So yeah, to the extent that, you know, I can as a human with my own kind of limitations and biases and privileges and things like that, I felt like I was very able to hold space for everyone and their experiences. And then I had a client cancel. So I ended up having this like gap in my day at like 2 p.m. And I think I dissociated. I don't know what happened. All I know is I found myself in the kitchen eating my kids' Halloween candy at 2 p.m., just like zoning out. I don't typically work from home, but I was working from home because I was sick enough to not come into the office. So I was in my kitchen. And while I'm eating candy, not realizing that I'm even eating candy, my husband appears in the kitchen and I was just looking at him while I'm eating candy. And I was just like, I don't think I'm doing well. I'm eating candy. And he's like, I came downstairs to get candy too. I don't feel good. And that was we entered the funk. Fortunately, I guess, yeah, for me, I can like compartmentalize and hop back into it. So I think enough of my brain knew that I had this gap in my schedule. I was going to flip out and enter a funk and eat candy. And then I was going to be fine for my next session. But I definitely had that moment. And that is like how I was most, like my personal process was affected. But meanwhile, in between sessions, like those little gaps between sessions, I was texting all of my therapist friends because I was like, oh my gosh, we are doing this, like we're processing this at the same time as our clients. So I literally was like texting all of my therapist friends, like, how are you doing? Are you seeing therapy clients today? Can I be supportive? And in my circles, yeah, people were having their own versions of having a hard time. So that was what inspired this episode. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I think like there's the initial shock for some of us of the results of the election. But if what happened after the 2016 election, repeats in any ways, like I just remember it was just like the aftermath. Truly, it's like the long marathon of like, yeah, working with a client who's afraid that their family member is going to be deported, or like, those kinds of close calls happening over and over and over again over 4 years, or like as new policies get implemented, and more people having like legitimate things happening that encroach on their rights. Says Marie, who votes very left-leaning. You might disagree if you don't vote similarly to how I vote. I get it. But this is how it affected me and the people around me. It was more of like, it's less about like that election day or week and more of like watching that presidency unfold and just grieving kind of over and over and over again personally. So that's kind of what I'm gearing up for. I think there was sort of a protective mechanism. It was like, don't go too deep into the grief this time, Marie, right now. Because right now we voted for this person, but, we have 4 years ahead of us. So let's kind of save the energy for when I'm sure it's going to be needed and applicable over the next 4 years. You don't have to agree with me. I'm just sharing my experience. Okay, so the next question I asked is, what's been the most positive part about supporting your therapy clients post-election? And speaking back to this idea of like how many people responded to this poll compared to usual, there were far fewer people who responded to this question. Far fewer. It was 15 people who responded, and I think it was 23 who responded to the last one. Yes. So 15 people responded to this one, but it's also like I had 3 separate questions, so you just had drop off from each question. Like people are like, I answered one, I think I'm done. So it might have been that. It might have been that it was hard to name a positive or some mixture of both. We may never know the answer, but just noting that. Here someone says, I suppose it's quite validating to hear others with similar views. Someone else says the most positive part was to let them know and understand their resiliency. And then again, someone else says, trying to remind them of our resiliency. And this is an interesting thought. Someone says, it reaffirms that I only have clients well suited for me to be useful for them. That's kind of an interesting framing, and I can only read into it and guess without actually knowing what's going on for this specific person. But that is an interesting question. Like, are the people on your caseload primarily aligned with you and how they vote? I don't know if that's what this person specifically meant when they said this, but that's the question that comes to mind. I would say for me, the majority of my clients tend to vote similar to how I vote, but not all of them, for sure, not all of them. So that's interesting. And then like, how can we be useful to clients who vote differently than us? I'm sure we can. Another person says a positive was seeing folks get angry and want to take action. And someone else says grieving together. Someone says feeling like I'm actually helping in a time that feels helpless. Yeah, that's definitely one that I connect with a lot. Someone says connecting on a human level, most of my clients align in our responses. Kind of back to that idea of like, it feels good to have clients who maybe align with how you voted or that sort of thing. Someone says, I'm grateful they have a safe space to talk. Most of my clients don't feel supported in their beliefs. Someone else says, providing a safe space for clients to express disappointment. This is an interesting one. Someone says a positive of supporting their clients is seeing clients have more clarity on what matters to them because of the election and making a plan to do the good in the world they've been wanting to do. Yeah, it is kind of interesting. Like, sometimes things not going our way, I'm making an assumption about the phrasing of that last one, that those clients maybe felt like the election didn't go their way. Things not going our way can mobilize us to do things that are important to us. I know that that's generally been my approach to life. Like, I had panic disorder. I had a very inappropriate therapist in high school when I was trying to deal with the panic disorder. And so I said like, wow, I didn't know it could be this bad. Let me try to figure it out myself. And then that's when I went to the library and figured out how to treat myself for panic disorder, overcame panic disorder, and I was like, I'm going to be a therapist because I can at least do better than that dude. That's just one story. But I have a bunch of those stories where it's like, when things don't go my way, I'm like, okay, we'll buckle up because we're going to do something about it then, I guess. Someone else says a positive was hope and the goodness of people never dies. I wonder if it was hope in the goodness of people never dies. And someone else says giving hope to people who are being encouraged to be hopeless. That's an interesting phrasing. Being encouraged to be hopeless. I wonder what's going on with that dynamic. And someone else says to recognize our humanity and finding practical ways to build community and strength. And this last one I think is interesting. Someone says, I processed with my clients. It was actually really beneficial for me. Yeah, that's really interesting. That reminds me of, I felt similarly like during COVID. That was like when we're going through a shared experience as a society, as a culture, as a world, like, is it appropriate or even helpful, not just for us, obviously, but helpful for our clients too, to see like, oh, my therapist is also processing through this. And obviously that's something to be mindful of like, is this going to benefit my clients? Or, some clients might find that less helpful. Like, oh no, even my therapist doesn't know what to do or whatever. And maybe that might freak some clients out. But I know at least for me, anything that helps me see the humanity of my therapist just makes me feel more human. And the last question I was wondering about, which clearly some people already touched on in their earlier responses, was how has it affected you to support your therapy clients while doing your own processing? And for this one, 13 people responded. Here are some of the responses. It's been hard. I'm going through IVF and all of them also have fears of their reproductive rights. Ooh, yeah, it's hard when if you're personally dealing with something and then you're supporting your clients going through a similar thing. Like, it's really, really difficult. Someone else says, reminds me of last time and pandemic when nobody knew WTF was going to happen. Yeah, we've had some really chaotic elections, just in general. Someone says, it's been difficult to not allow my personal beliefs, feelings, and frustration come in session. And it even says something like, are we not allowed to let those beliefs come in? Obviously, in some situations, it wouldn't be appropriate. Are there some situations where it is? How do you sort of discern when it's going to be helpful for your clients? But certainly if it's for you and not for your client, it may still be difficult to do. Someone says, our shared values and beliefs made it easier to talk things through. And someone says, it got me out of my own head a little bit, which I needed. Yeah, that's generally, as a therapist in general, if I have something that I'm in my head about, it doesn't matter what it is. Seeing therapy clients will help me get out of my head almost 100% of the time. But I know that that's not true of everyone. That's like a Mariaism for sure. And someone says, it's been tough, but also helpful in sitting with others in collective grief. And someone else says, it's been meaningful, helpful, and heavy in turns. And here someone says, I'm thrilled, but I'm professional and keep it separate. And someone says, feeling helpless in helping. clients' future concerns regarding Trump. And someone says, it's heavy and exhausting. I've needed extra self-care, hard to disconnect my own feelings. And here someone says, I've been surprised at my ability to support both types of voters. Yes, you got the chameleon effect down. As I read this one, it feels like it might touch on a little bit what I brought up at the beginning about how, it's really important to make sure we see what's really going on for somebody if they vote differently than us, right? It doesn't mean that we have no ability to have empathy or see how somebody might have arrived at a very different decision than us, even if we're really upset about that decision, even to say like, okay, I see how this made sense for this person to arrive at this decision while holding space for their goodness and their values and their humanity. I think that's a difficult skill to learn. I don't even know like how to teach that. Like, is there a way to teach that well when we're children so that we can like bring that with us? Because I don't think we're doing a good job teaching that, but I don't necessarily know how to address that. But that's something I think about a lot. And someone says, my state voted in a popular policy I disagree with, and I feel lonely in my disappointment. And someone says, after sessions, a weight is lifted off me knowing where we all stand, and I feel privileged and honored. That's really interesting. Without even knowing what they mean by where we all stand, there is, for this person, some connection, it sounds like. Whew. Well, I feel like I went on a roller coaster ride because even like I didn't even organize the responses by like, because you can kind of tell, like sometimes you can tell how someone probably voted for the presidential election just based on how they're answering the questions. And you have different ways of voting and different ways of perceiving the situation. Like I didn't even clump those together because I didn't want to like insert my own assumptions. I literally like, this was chronological order, the order that these responses came in, that I read them. And so I just felt like I went on the roller coaster ride with them. But maybe that kind of represents, like, that's where we're at. Like, there's so many of us with such strong feelings, and people with medium feelings. Like, not everyone's going to have strong feelings. Also, not everyone voted. Like, there's a whole gamut of experiences, and we're going to have different experiences as therapists. Our clients are going to have different experiences from each other and from us, and sometimes more similar experiences. And it's kind of like, it just feels like a wild ride, like a wild roller coaster ride, but it's not pretend. So, I mean, pretend like a roller coaster is supposed to be fun, and I don't like this ride. This one's not as fun. Not fun at all. It does feel like a lot to me to just even read your responses, let alone like notice my own reactions and responses to your responses. And as much of a roller coaster ride as it's been for me, as maybe it's been for you as well, to go through all of those, I really just wanted to genuinely get a pulse of like, what's this been like for folks? And I get that it's going to be a biased pulse of, first of all, people who follow me on Instagram and are on Instagram to see my poll, and then people who respond to the poll. I think there's also a bias of like, if you think I'm going to potentially agree with whatever you have to say, then maybe you're more likely to share. And if you think maybe I potentially don't agree, it potentially feels like a bigger risk. So even though I'm sure there's all kinds of biases, filtering in, I just wanted to see what kind of a pulse I could get from a poll like this. How has it been going? And if somehow it is feeling weighty, affecting you quite a bit, it's totally valid. Or, for some people, it might like take a minute to sort of settle and then hit later. And that's okay too. Whatever you might be going through, I just hope you feel seen and cared for. And I do think as therapists, like when we're parallel processing with our clients, any like major events that are happening across an entire community or an entire nation or an entire world, things like that, it's always helpful to make sure we have like extra supports around us because it can be a lot. And this is just like for my own, self-care. I'm just going to reiterate, I don't intend anything that I said in this episode to be inflammatory, because I can already fill in the blanks of like who's going to find what inflammatory, or even just how I approach this entire episode potentially as inflammatory, because like it didn't sound like I was advocating for this side or that side or whatever. And I have my opinions. If you listen to the extended cut version, I share my opinions. But like, I don't want to increase whatever inflammatory stuff is out there, because ultimately I do want us as humanity and as the US to come together in all of our differences. And the only way forward, in my opinion, to do that is to actively pull away from things that might be inflammatory and polarizing while still holding space for our opinions? Can we do that? I know it's a lot to ask. Isn't that what we teach our clients? Like, kind of feels like a little bit of DBT in there. I'm clearly processing as I make this video, so I'm sure I'll edit this back and I'll watch myself say these things a gajillion times and I'll be like, oh my gosh, Marie, I wish you had done this differently. I guess if there's something like that, then I'll write it in the description box. So if that's something you're interested in, you can find it there. But wherever you're at, in case you need to hear it, you're doing a good job. Thank you for supporting your clients through all the things, whether they notice that you're also a human, maybe going through all the things as well or not, whether they agree with you or not, whether you're having a hard time or not. You're doing a good job. Whew. Well, if you listen to the extended cut version of this episode, I know that this was long. I know it. So thank you for joining me. I hope that it was helpful to you in some way. And if you need to practice a little self-care now after, I really support you doing that as well. If you need to like zone out or what, I don't know. For me, zoning out is like self-care. I'm about to close up here. I'm going to pick up my girls and go to dance class, which feels like really task switchy. But you know what? That's life. That's normal. Thank you so much for joining me in this episode. Thank you again to all of you who submitted your responses, sending all my heart emojis your way, wherever you might be at with everything going on with the election and supporting your clients. And until next time, from one therapist to another, I wish you well.